Section 17 of the Romance of Polar Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. The Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott. Chapter 14. Voyages of the Erebus and Terror. The American and French expeditions having already selected areas for their operations, Sir James Ross, not wishing to clash with them in any way, directed his attention to that part of the Antarctic lying to the south of Australia and New Zealand as his sphere of operations. Fortune favoured him in that selection, for it is at this part of the Antarctic region, situated between the meridians of 160 degrees east and 160 degrees western longitude, that open water extends farthest into the high latitudes. He chose the meridian of 170 degrees east as the line on which to sail to the south. It was on this meridian that Baldwin, in 1839, had found open water as high as 69 degrees south. The Erebus and Terror were equally fortunate, and they were well to the south before they encountered sufficient ice to prove difficult for navigation. Mostly they encountered icebergs, and they were thus afforded excellent opportunities to note the peculiarities of the southern bergs, and to compare them with those of the Arctic. There was a manifest difference in both form and structure. Those of the Antarctic showed little variety in shape, and in this they were in marked contrast to the Arctic bergs. The bergs of the south were very solid in appearance, with perpendicular grooves on the sides and level tabletop summits. In size they ranged from 120 to 180 feet in height, with a length varying from a few hundred yards to a couple of miles. Land was first sighted on the 11th of January 1841, when the ships were in latitude 70 degrees 23 minutes south and longitude 174 degrees 50 minutes east. The appearance of the land suggested the tops of mountain peaks fully 100 miles away. As the ships sailed on, other peaks showed above the horizon, both to the east and the west, and the majesty of their size left no room for doubt that they were part of an area of land attaining to continental proportions. In his account of the expedition, Sir James Ross wrote, "It was a beautifully clear evening, and we had a most enchanting view of the two magnificent ranges of mountains, whose lofty peaks, perfectly covered with eternal snow, rose to elevations varying from 7,000 to 10,000 feet above the level of the ocean. The glaciers that filled their intervening valleys, and which descended from near the mountain summits, projected in many places several miles into the sea, and terminated in lofty perpendicular cliffs. In a few places the rock broke through the icy covering, by which alone we could be assured that land formed the nucleus of this, to appearance, enormous iceberg. The range was named Admiralty Mountains, and the various peaks after the different lords of the Admiralty. With patriotic pride the leader recorded that "the discovery of this land restored to Great Britain the honour of having discovered the southernmost known land, which had been so nobly won by the intrepid Bellinghausen, and for more than 20 years retained by Russia." The amount of ice along and off the shore prevented a landing being made, but it was found to be possible to get ashore on an island not far away from the mainland. The island was named Possession Island, in commemoration of the fact that on its shores the ceremony of taking possession of the newly discovered land in the name of Great Britain was duly celebrated. Situated in latitude 71 degrees 56 minutes south and longitude 171 degrees 7 minutes east, the island was found to be of igneous formation, and accessible only on its western shore. There were no signs of vegetation on the bare volcanic rock, but myriads of penguins completely and densely covered the whole surface of the island, along the ledges of the precipices and even to the summits of the hills, attacking us vigorously as we waded through their ranks, and pecking at us with their sharp beaks, disputing possession, which, with their loud, coarse notes, and the insuperable stench from the deep bed of guano, which had been forming for ages, and which may, at some time, be valuable to the agriculturists of our Australian colonies, made us glad to get away again after having loaded our boats with geological specimens and penguins. As the voyage continued, the height of the mountains lying further to the south of Admiralty Mountains was observed to be from 12,000 to 14,000 feet, the majority being obviously of volcanic origin. While noting these characteristics, a phenomenon was witnessed which, for the moment, suggested that they were in the presence of a mighty volcanic upheaval. An angle was being measured when, in the line of sight, an island, about 100 feet high, suddenly seemed to rise from the ocean. All eyes were turned upon it, the dark colour of the new arrival standing out in such pronounced contrast with the whiteness of the ice around it. Then one, more observant than the rest, drew attention to the fact that a large berg previously observed at the place where the island had risen had completely disappeared. At once the riddle was solved. The berg had turned over, and as the lower portion was composed of earth-stained ice, it stood out in such a strong relief against the other ice that the mistake was easily accounted for. One of the mountains slowly coming into view on the horizon as the ships continued their way was so remarkably like Mount Etna in appearance that it was so named by the members of the expedition. But official requirements of the case necessitated another name being given to it. It was entered in the record as Mount Melbourne, while another, lying beyond it, was named Mount Monteagle. These were the highest mountains seen up to that time, and presented an imposing appearance. Yet others were sighted in the course of a few days, which quite eclipsed them. These were the two volcanoes which were named after the two vessels, Mount Erebus and Mount Terror. Mount Erebus, 12,400 feet high, was in active eruption when first seen, and has been so on every occasion that man has looked upon it since. At the time of its discovery it was giving a display that was extraordinarily grand, the more so by reason of its surroundings. It was snow-clad to within a few hundred feet of its conical summit, while its huge base rested on a wide stretch of ice, gleaming and shimmering in the sunlight. Between the ice wall, hundreds of feet high, which marked the coastline, and the vessels, the water was blue and clear, reflecting the hue of the sky above. From the crater alternate bursts of smoke and flame were flung up, the rumbling sound of the explosions floating down through the frozen stillness in a faint echo like that of a heavy distant artillery fire. In the official account it is described as follows: a volume of dense smog was projected at each successive jet with great force, in a vertical column to a height of between 1,500 and 2,000 feet above the mouth of the crater, when, condescending at its upper part, it descended in mist or snow, to be succeeded by another splendid exhibition of the same kind in about half an hour afterwards, although the intervals between the eruptions were by no means regular. The diameter of the column of smoke was between 200 and 300 feet, as near as we could measure it. Whenever the smoke cleared away, the bright red flames that filled the mouth of the crater were clearly perceptible, and some of the officers believed they could see streams of lava pouring down its side until lost beneath the snow, which descended from a few hundred feet below the crater and projected its perpendicular icy cliffs several miles into the ocean. So far as the leader of the expedition was concerned, there was another circumstance in connection with the position in which the ships were that appealed to him very particularly. He had, a few years earlier, succeeded in locating the North Magnetic Pole. Bearings, taken in the neighbourhood of the two volcanoes, revealed the fact that the South Magnetic Pole was only about 170 miles distant. An effort was made to penetrate to the south, so as to sail over, or otherwise locate, the exact position of the magnetic pole, but the weather conditions, which had been so favourable to them up to that point, now told severely against them. The thermometer fell rapidly, and the temperature went so low that the spray flung up by the ships froze as it fell into solid ice on the bows. Men were kept constantly breaking it away, but still it accumulated, considerably interfering with the speed of the ships. Then they found in front of them a great wall of ice rising out of the sea, without a break or opening, to a height of some hundreds of feet. They sailed along it for miles, but the only change was that it increased in height until it towered 1,000 feet above the level of the ocean. Although it was then midsummer, and the warmest part of the year, the highest temperature during the day was never above 20 degrees below freezing. At the corresponding period of the season in the Arctic, every iceberg gives evidence of the warmer weather by commencing to melt, so that from all of them streams of water are to be seen pouring down the sides. But the bergs in the Antarctic showed no such streams of water. All were solid, and the heat of the sun at midday was not able to cause even the surface to thaw. During a gale encountered in this locality, the waves, as they broke over the sides, covered the rigging and sails with hard, clear ice, until it was almost impossible to handle the ropes or furl the sails. As February went by, and they were still unable to work nearer the side of the magnetic pole, the leader sought for a haven where the ships could pass the winter, so as to be ready to recommence the work directly the weather moderated with the approach of spring. But no such place was to be found, the mighty barrier of ice stretching away to the horizon with never a break in its massive towering front. Nothing was to be done except turn the vessels to the north and make the best of their way into milder latitudes until the winter had passed. On the voyage towards the north, one of those accidents occurred to the Terror which, fortunately for the welfare of the sailors, are not possible nowadays. The bobstay of the bowsprit was smashed by coming in contact with a mass of floating ice. At the time the temperature was such that the bows of the vessel, as well as the bowsprit and its rigging, were all covered with ice, which the men had to be continually trying to keep clear. With the ship pitching to a heavy head sea, this was by no means easy, yet it was simple compared to the work of repairing the damaged bobstay. The men carrying out the work had to be slung over the bows, and every time the ship pitched they were plunged into the freezing water, often being entirely immersed. The temperature of the sea at that time was 12 degrees below freezing, and 2 hours were occupied in effecting the repairs, man after man going over the bows to take the places of those who were literally frozen out. The commander, with pardonable pride, commented upon the pluck and hardy determination of his men in carrying out this arduous task. As they sailed to their winter quarters in an easterly course, they passed the locality where the ships of the American expedition had reported a discovery of land forming part of the great Antarctic continent. A sharp lookout was kept for it, but no indications were seen, and when the two ships sailed over the spot where the continent was supposed to exist, the conclusion was forced upon the leaders that the Americans had been misled, as they had themselves on more than one occasion, into regarding the combination of ice and cloud as land. So suggestive of land did this combination often appear, that it was only by the most careful and critical observation that similar mistakes were not to be recorded against the Erebus and Terror. Early in April they arrived in Tasmania, leaving that colony in the following July for New Zealand, where they stayed until December, when they sailed once more to the Antarctic. It was the intention of Ross to sail to the south along the 146th meridian of west longitude, but the existence of heavy pack ice proved an effectual obstacle to their progress. The ships became involved in the pack, and only managed to force their way clear by the beginning of February. This meant a great loss of valuable time, for they were only able to reach 76 degrees 42 minutes southern latitude before they had to return. They sighted the Great Barrier of ice lying to the south, with what appeared to be high mountains, snow-covered, rising behind. As no definite observation could be made to demonstrate whether the heights were mountains or only the summit of the Antarctic ice cap, the discovery was not claimed as being new land. The vessels made their way to the Falkland Islands, where they passed the winter, and on December 17th, 1842, they sailed for the third time to the south. The object of this voyage was to further explore Louis Philippe Land and reach as high as Weddell had done. Excellent progress was made, and on the last day of the year they sighted an island to which the name Etna Island was given, as it was a volcano greatly resembling in miniature the great volcano of Sicily. Further to the south high peaks appeared, and with the new year a number of islands, as well as what appeared to be portions of the mainland, were discovered. Amongst others, the expedition found and named Paulet Island, Cockburn Island, Snow Hill Island, and Mount Haddington, places which were to be made still more familiar over half a century later by the dramatic events which occurred to the Swedish expedition in 1901 to 1903. In addition to the discovery of land, it was also found that the waters off this coast abounded with whales, and by the time that the two ships returned to the Cape of Good Hope in March, they were able to claim, for the record of the third trip, the double discovery of land and of all the essentials for a profitable whaling industry. The ships had circumnavigated the Antarctic region, and for many years thereafter whalers were the main visitors. Until 1898 no official British expedition sailed for the Atlantic, though there was a brief stay, just within the Antarctic Circle, of HMS Challenger in 1874. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Romance of Polar Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. The Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott. Chapter 15. The Southern Cross Expedition. The first British expedition for many years was that which sailed from the Thames in 1898 on board the Southern Cross, under the leadership of C. E. Borchgrevink, with the object of penetrating as far as was possible to the south and exploring the Antarctic continent, or as much of it as could be visited during a year's stay in those latitudes. The leader of the party had already been on this continent in 1894, when he voyaged into the Antarctic on board a whaler. He had landed on South Victoria Land and Possession Island, and had reached as far south as 74 degrees 10 minutes south. He had discovered a sheltered beach near Cape Adare, which he recognized as an ideal site for the headquarters of an exploring party equipped for a prolonged stay. On the same occasion he was fortunate in finding a lichen growing on the rocks of Cape Adare, which was the first instance of terrestrial plant life being observed in the Arctic. Imbued with enthusiasm as to the prospects of successful observation being carried out from this point, he strove to arouse public interest in the project. He found plenty of interest, but not much financial support, until he had the good fortune to meet Sir George Newnes, Baronet, in 1898. That gentleman caught some of the enthusiasm which actuated Borchgrevink, and undertook to provide the necessary capital to enable the expedition to be formed and dispatched. Thereafter there was no delay in the matter of organizing the expedition. The Southern Cross, a small bark-rigged steamer of 276 tons, and built by Colin Archer, the builder of the Fram, was secured, and placed under the command of Captain Bernard Jensen. With stores and equipment for some years, a crew of Norwegians, an efficient scientific staff, and a large kennel of Arctic dogs, she left St. Catherine's Dock on the 22nd of August, 1898, amid much popular demonstration, and sailed for Tasmania. Arriving at Hobart early in December, she took in further supplies, and sailed again, on the 19th of December, for the Antarctic. On the 30th of December, in latitude 61 degrees 57 minutes south, and longitude 153 degrees 53 minutes east, she encountered the first ice, and a few days later was among the floes. Some carrier pigeons had been taken on board at Hobart, and they were liberated when the vessel was well within the ice limit. One was absent for about a week before it returned to the ship, but the majority returned almost at once. On the 14th of January 1899, land, Balleny Island, was sighted in latitude 65 degrees 44 minutes south, and longitude 163 degrees 38 minutes east, and the Southern Cross was soon fast in a pack. Advantage was taken of the opportunity to lay in a store of seal flesh for the dogs. Two varieties were met with on the ice, leopard seals and white seals. both so unaccustomed to the presence of men that the explorers had no difficulty in walking up to them and killing them as they lay on the ice. After being held for a week, the first nip was experienced. The movement in the ice was very pronounced, and the high-pressure ridges were thrown up. When the pressure caught the ship, there was some uneasiness in the minds of those on board as to how she would stand the strain. She disposed of all fears, so far as she was concerned, by rising a clear 4 feet when the nip was at its worst, thereby adding another instance to the record of her builder as a cunning designer of ships for ice navigation. For a period of 48 days they were held in the pack, and the ice then becoming more broken, it was decided not to try any further to reach to the south of Baleine Island. Instead, it was determined to go direct to Cape Adare and establish the headquarters while the summer was still with them. On the 12th of February, a few days after getting into open water, and when the vessel was making good progress under sail and steam, she was noticed to shake violently. No ice was in sight, nor anything else that could account for it, but there came a tremor which lasted for a couple of seconds, followed by another after an interval of 3 seconds. The phenomenon was noticed by men in all parts of the ship, and no explanation could be given for it. A couple of days later they ran into heavy weather, during which the temperature fell so low that everything became covered with ice, an experience which was very similar to that which befell the ships forming Sir James Ross's expedition in 1842. The ship had to lay to for 2 weeks until the weather abated, and on the second day after resuming her course, land was sighted, and the Southern Cross steamed into Robertson Bay in sight of Cape Adare, and the spot where the headquarters of the expedition were to be built. The camp consisted of 4 huts, which were promptly erected and filled with the stores and equipment. The landing party, consisting of 10, made their home in one of the huts, utilizing the others for the storage of provisions, equipment, and other impedimenta. The dwelling hut was constructed with 3 doors, opening inwards, so as to facilitate the escape of the residents should they become snowed in. Between the outer and the middle doors there was a 4-foot lobby, of which a small room opened on either side. One of these was devoted to the development of photographs and the storage of the more delicate instruments, while the other was the taxidermist's studio. Both these rooms were lined with wool and fur, and were entered through small sliding trapdoors 2 feet above the ground. The interior of the hut formed one room, 15 feet square, and with 10 bunks constructed along the north and east walls, each bunk being closed in, so that the occupant could lie within, out of sight of the others, a very serviceable arrangement under circumstances where 10 men were compelled to be in one another's company morning, noon, and night for several months at a stretch. The windows faced the west, and were double-framed, with a space of 3 inches between the frames. The walls were also double, with papier-mâché packing between, while the ceiling was 7 feet above the floor, also packed with papier-mâché, and had above it an attic, where stores which required keeping fairly warm were placed. Before they had everything completed on shore, a furious gale sprang up, and from the 23rd to the 26th of February all the energies of the party were required to keep the ship from being lost. She dragged her anchor and drifted dangerously near the coast before steam could be got up, and even when the engines were at full speed she could barely do more than hold her own. Once 2 steel cables and a hawser were run out round a jutting rock to afford her some stay, but they snapped like threads where the puff caught her, and for the rest of the time she was kept standing off and on under the lee of Cape Adare. During the winter the explorers had further experience of the character of these southern gales, the wind often attaining a velocity of 85 miles an hour, representing a force capable of lifting up and carrying bodily away such a thing as a whaleboat, while the air was at such times filled with pebbles and small stones blown from the high lands behind the camp. On one occasion, so fierce was the strength of the wind that it was found impossible to crawl on hands and knees, and with the assistance of a guiding rope, from the hut to the thermometer's box a couple of 100 yards away. The heaviest member of the party, a man over 13 stone, was blown from the rope and nearly lost while attempting the journey. On the 2nd of March everything was in order at the huts, and the shore party landed to take up their residence. The flag presented to the expedition by the Duke of York was hoisted, the Southern Cross dipped her ensign to it, everybody cheered, and the vessel steamed out of the bay for New Zealand, leaving the devoted then the only occupants of the great unknown continent which lies 2,500 miles to the south of Australia. They were not long before they commenced work. Cape Adare was explored and its height determined to be 3,670 feet above sea level. Vegetation, in the form of lichens, was traced up to 1,000 feet, to which level it was found the penguins made their crude nests and hatched their young. Snow lay deep after 3,000 feet, but no signs of life, vegetable or animal, were discovered at that altitude. In the waters below and around the cape several specimens of algae, medusa, hydroids, and other low forms of marine life were secured. In addition to these specimens, it was also discovered that there was abundance of fish in the deeper waters of the bay. These were caught both by net and line, and the members of the expedition were agreeably surprised when it was found that they were nearly all edible, for a constant diet of preserved food soon palls, even on the healthiest appetites. As the ice spread further out over the bay, the fishing was conducted through a hole cut through the ice, and it was not uncommon experience of the fisher to be suddenly confronted with the startled eyes of a seal which had risen from the depth below, under the belief that the opening was a blow-hole for his convenience. On the 15th of May they saw the sun disappear below the horizon, above which it would not reappear until the 27th of July. The sun, as it disappeared, presented a curious optical phenomenon. Its reflection appeared as a large red elliptical glowing body, which gradually changed into a cornered square, while the sky, in its immediate vicinity, revelled in a blaze of colours. As the sun slowly sank, the colours grew in intensity, reaching the height of their vivid beauty as the last of the globe sank out of sight. The aurora australis continued to give them displays of colouring throughout the time when the moon was not shining and the sky was otherwise dark. The temperature sank very low, at times during the night -25° Fahrenheit being recorded, soon after the sun went below the horizon, while later on the records were as low as -57° Fahrenheit. Inside the hut, however, the cold was not severely felt, the construction proving excellent for the comfort of the men. The numbers of seals killed for the dogs enabled them to cover the roof with the skins before it became snowed over, while the ample supply of fur and woolen clothing kept the expedition well clad. With one exception, the winter passed without an untoward incident, the exception being the illness of the zoologist of the party, who, after being carefully nursed by the doctor and all the others, succumbed to internal complications and died on the 13th of October. This was the only fatality during the expedition, and the loss of one out of so small a party naturally had a saddening effect on the survivors. Before he died he indicated a spot 1,000 feet up the slope of Cape Adare where he wished to be buried, and, needless to add, his comrades loyally carried out his last wishes. He died just at the time when the penguins, the study of which so engrossed him, were returning over the ice to their nesting quarters. The first one arrived a few hours before his death, and it was taken to him at his request. The place where he sleeps is on the line where vegetation ceases and above which the penguins do not build. It was a pity he did not live to see the return of the penguins, for they came in myriads with the approach of spring. They advanced over the ice in a long line, walking in single file, and apparently in detachments of about 60 birds in each. They must have marched for many miles, as there was no open water nearer, from whence they could have come, and they are not able to fly. As soon as they reached the land they spread out in such a way as to suggest that each pair went to the nest they had occupied before. These were simple affairs, consisting of little more than a few pebbles arranged in a ring on beds of guano. As a rule, 2 eggs were laid in each nest, and, for a month, male and female shared the labour of sitting on them, commencing in November and remaining on the nest until the young came out in December. The chicks were fed by the parent birds until they were fairly well grown, when they were driven into packs and left to look after themselves, with only occasional help from the older birds. When they were able to look after themselves without further assistance, the parents departed. On such occasions a curious habit was observed. The birds of a detachment seemed to wait for one another until all were ready, when they would strut in a solemn procession to the water's edge. Usually the white breasts of the birds were spotlessly clean, but the time they spent on the nests made them very dingy in appearance. As they strutted down to the water's edge, they were all sadly in need of a bath, yet on arrival at the edge they would stand about, shiver, flap their diminutive wings, and manifest all the hesitation which is shown by timid bathers when about to take a plunge. Nothing would induce them to enter the water until they were ready in their own good time, attempts on the part of the explorers to drive them in merely resulting in the birds turning round and strutting on to the land again. When at length the time came for the plunge, one would flap his wings, utter a cry, and take a header, whereupon the others would follow, one after the other, all in line, and so rapidly that they presented the appearance of a stream being poured out of a bottle. The plunge over, they returned to the shore, spotless and clean. As the gales were not over when the birds were sitting, they were watched to see how they would prevent themselves from being blown away by the fierce gusts. Almost as soon as the barometer gave indications of the approach of a gale, the birds were seen to turn their heads towards the south-east, the quarter from whence the winds came, and lie close to the ground, with their heads down and their breasts pressed close to it. On no occasion was a bird seen to be blown away from the nest. During December, when the weather became milder, the interesting discovery was made that insect life exists on the Antarctic land. Some specimens were found among the mosses growing on the shore, and the excitement which followed the discovery led one of the Finns, 2 of whom were included in the party, to unconsciously play an effective practical joke on the others. He found a dead blowfly in a case of jam and brought it to the hut as a trophy. For a time there was even greater excitement, until someone thought to ask where the fly had been captured. On the 29th of January, 1900, the Southern Cross returned. She arrived in the bay at a time when the explorers were sleeping after some heavy journeys. The captain landed, and walking up to the hut, pushed the door open and entered. He had the mail bag with him, and flung it on the table with a loud cry of "Post!" In a moment the bunks were empty, the sound of a strange voice rousing all the men, to say nothing of the prospects of receiving news from the world out of which they had been so long. As there was no time to be lost, if they were to penetrate further to the south before the mild weather passed, they moved on board the ship as soon as they could, and by the 2nd of February the Southern Cross steamed away again with all on board. They made excellent progress, passing Mount Melbourne on the 2nd of February, approaching near enough to the coast opposite the Mount Terror to permit them to land, after which they steamed along the great ice barrier until they found an opening, into which they steamed, so as to enable a sledge party to land and push forward to the south. It was this sledge party which reached farthest south, being on the 16th of February in latitude 78 degrees 50 minutes south, the highest latitude reached up to that time. But it was while they were ashore at Mount Terror that one of the most exciting incidents of the whole journey occurred. The party landed at a small beach which lay under cliffs towering 500 feet above. In order to get photographs of it, the boat was dispatched back to the ship for a camera, while Borchgrevink and Jensen remained ashore. The boat had not gone very far when a great roar sounded in the air. Those on shore feared for the moment that a slide had begun in the cliffs over their heads, but it was not the rocks that were moving. A mighty glacier, which entered the sea near where they were standing, was shedding an iceberg from the parent mass, and the noise was caused by the rending of the ice, as the millions of tons mass tore itself free. The beach was barely 4 feet above the water, and as the berg crashed into the sea, it sent up a great wave that swept along the coast. The men on the beach barely saw it coming before it was over them. Pressing themselves against the face of the cliff, at the highest point they could reach, they held on for dear life, while the icy water surged up and over them. After the first wave had passed, others followed, though these only reached up to their armpits, and had it not been for a projecting point of rock, which served to break the force of the waves, there is little doubt but that both would have been swept away. The full force of the waves was shown only a few yards away from where the two had stood, stones being torn loose, and the mark of the water being left 20 feet up the face of the cliff. Having reached farthest south, the homeward journey was begun on the 19th of February, and 3 days later the Southern Cross steamed into Port Ross, in the island of Auckland. The expedition was then practically at an end, having succeeded so well in its objects that it was able to claim that it had located the southern magnetic pole, as being in latitude 73 degrees 20 minutes south and longitude 146 degrees east, had discovered insect and plant life on the Antarctic continent, had reached the farthest south, and had added very considerably to the geographical and scientific knowledge of the world. End of section 18. Section 19 of The Romance of Polar Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. The Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott. Chapter 16. The Revival of Antarctic Interest. Towards the end of the last century there was a distinct revival in European scientific circles of interest in the still unsolved problems of the frozen South. Many causes contributed to this. The gradual narrowing of the northern sphere, and the activity displayed in that region by the Americans, to whom it especially appealed, led the European geographers to remember the great amount of work yet to be done in the South. The achievements of the Ross expedition, which had satisfied public curiosity for the time being, now only stimulated curiosity as to how much more could be ascertained by the use of modern steamships, and all the other improved appliances that had done so much to help in Arctic work. For a time private enterprise operated, and several vessels were dispatched from time to time, some with excellent results. But something more than private enterprise, working individually, was required if all the benefits of a thorough exploration were to be obtained. In her brief experience in 1874, HMS Challenger examined, by means of sounding and dredging, the floor of the ocean to the south of Kerguelen Island. The evidence collected pointed to the existence, still further to the south, of an area of land approaching continental dimensions. In 1898 a German steamer, the Valdavia, with Professor Carl Chun on board, left Cape Town, rediscovered Bouvet Island, which had not been visited from the time it was first seen by Captain Cook, and collected further evidence, by sounding and dredging, of the existence of extensive land nearer the pole. A Belgian, Monsieur Adrien de Gerlache, fitted out a ship, the Belgica, and sailed from Antwerp in 1897 to explore the area lying to the south of South America. In the early part of the voyage a new strait was discovered between Danko Land and Palmer Land. But in February 1898 the ship became involved in the ice, and remained in it for a year, drifting between 69 degrees 40 minutes and 71 degrees 35 minutes southern latitude, and 80 degrees 30 minutes and 102 degrees 10 minutes western longitude. During the winter they had a period of 70 days' darkness spent on board, the effect of which was extremely depressing to their spirits and injurious to their health. It was found that the sea floor had shoaled up to the shallow depth of from 200 to 300 fathoms, suggesting the proximity of a large area of land, the actual existence of which, however, the members of the expedition were not able to observe. An international agreement was then arrived at, through the influence of the International Geographical Conference, under which three nations, Germany, Sweden, and Great Britain, undertook to dispatch to the Antarctic 3 separate expeditions, one from each country. They were to sail from Europe in 1901, and while working on similar lines, and as much in common as was possible, each was to have its distinct sphere of operations. The British undertook the exploration of that area south of Australia, where Ross had located the volcanoes Mount Erebus and Mount Terror. The Swedes elected the lands lying to the south of South America, while the Germans gave their attention to the seas already visited by the Valdavia. The German expedition sailed from Kiel on the 11th of August 1901 on board the Gauss, and was under the command of Professor Erich von Drygalski. Their first objective was Kerguelen Island, and the chief work carried out was of a purely scientific character. It was originally intended that all the expeditions should return to Europe after passing one winter in the Antarctic. The Germans did so, but both the Swedes and the British were unable to carry out this part of the programme, the former in consequence of the loss of their ship in the ice, the latter because their ship was hard and fast in the southern ice. The Germans were more fortunate in escaping the ill effects of what was an unusually severe ice season, but the other nations, by the longer stay they had in the frozen regions, were able to return with a much more comprehensive collection of information. Leaving a small party at Kerguelen Island, the Gauss sailed to her allotted area, already revealed by the voyages of Cook, Bellinghausen, Biscoe, and Kemp. The ice barrier prevented her reaching a very high latitude, but the connection between Knox Land and Kemp Land, appearing as isolated coasts on the old maps, was proved. On this land, during the winter, large quantities of ice are formed, to drift out to sea in the form of huge packs, which effectually guard the shore from intrusion. Forcing a way through the pack, the Gauss found a brief stretch of open water, the depth of which was found to shoal rapidly from 1,500 to 120 fathoms. This led them to a rugged, steep coastline, occupying the position of what Ross had defined in 1841 as ice cliffs. The land was too high and steep to permit them to land, and the ship becoming involved in the ice within sight of it, winter quarters were established on the ice. Severe gales hampered them in their work, but otherwise the winter passed without any untoward incident. The rocks composing the cliffs of the coast were found to be ancient crystalline formations. The interior of the land was entirely covered, so far as could be seen, by a solid ice cap forming one of the most extensive glacial regions now known to exist. It seemed to be slightly receding, though no definite evidence of this could be obtained in so short a time as that at the disposal of the explorers. One of the most useful observations made was that relating to the direction of the winds. The trade winds blowing in the roaring forties, and which serve so good a purpose in carrying ships round Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope, to and from Australia, blow from the west towards the east. At the position occupied by the Gauss, inside the Antarctic Circle, it was noticed that the prevailing winds were from east to west. Thus, if a clear passage could be found, vessels sailing round the Southern Ocean could select either an easterly or a westerly route as suited them best, instead of having, as at present, to follow that indicated by the wind. At the expiration of the period allotted to them for their stay, the explorers were able to get free from the ice and return to Germany. In this, as has been said, they were the only one of the 3 expeditions keeping to time. They arrived home from an absence of 28 months, 14 of which were passed in the South Polar ice. End of section 19. Section 20 of The Romance of Polar Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. The Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott. Chapter 17. The Swedish Expedition. The expedition to explore the land lying in the Antarctic region to the south of South America, which, under the international arrangement of 1895, was allotted to Sweden, was placed under the command of Professor Otto Nordenskjöld, with whom was associated Professor Johan Andersson, both members of Swedish universities. The steam bark Antarctica, Captain C.A. Larsen, who had already had considerable experience in the polar regions, was selected as the vessel in which the expedition was to proceed to the field of operations. The original plan was for the expedition to leave Europe in 1901, and to be back in Sweden by May 1903. The detailed plan was to leave Sweden as early as possible in the autumn of 1901 for the South Shetlands, whence the vessel was to go to the east coast of the land known to lie to the south of those islands. Penetrating as far to the south as possible, a station was to be established at any convenient point, and a party of 6 left there, with the necessary stores, apparatus, and equipment to spend the winter, while the ship was to return north to the Falkland Islands and spend the winter with the remainder of the expedition carrying out scientific investigations at Tierra del Fuego and South Georgia. On the arrival of spring, the Antarctica was to pick up the members of the expedition who might be in Tierra del Fuego and South Georgia, and proceed south to the winter station, take on board the members who had passed the winter there, and return at once to Sweden. Unfortunately for the successful carrying out of the plans, the summer of 1902-1903 in the Antarctic regions was the coldest and the worst for ice conditions that had ever been recorded, and the expedition, instead of being able to carry out the plans laid down, experienced, instead, a series of unexpected happenings which was fatal to the exact working out of detail, but was rich in exciting and romantic episode. The frozen South, like the frozen North, will not yield the secrets to the first comer who demands them. The resources of the ice world, at either pole, are too vast to be overcome without a fierce and prolonged struggle. Instead of one winter, the Swedish expedition spent 2 in the ice region, while during the second all the members of it were living on the ice, though as 3 separate parties, each within a few miles of the other, and all more or less ignorant of the proximity of their comrades. The peculiar circumstances under which they became separated, their experiences during that time, and the dramatic manner in which they were reunited and rescued, will form the chief incidents of the following pages. Leaving Sweden on the 17th of October 1901, the Antarctica proceeded to South America, where, at the request of the Argentine government, a representative of that country, in the person of Lieutenant Sobral of the Navy, joined the expedition. In return for this courtesy, the Argentine government offered to do all it could to assist the expedition. How magnificently it carried out its promise will be seen later. Early in January the ship was amongst the ice, making her way as fast as she could to the neighbourhood of Erebus and Terror Gulf, where it was hoped a suitable site would be found for the winter station. The state of the ice, however, was not favourable to this scheme, and by the time Seymour Island was sighted, it was evident that there was little chance of working into more southern latitudes. Nearly 10 years before, Captain Larsen had visited this island, and had taken from it specimens of fossil wood and molluscs, the first fossils ever discovered in the Antarctic. Before landing on it and seeking for more geological specimens, the leader determined to try whether there was any chance of penetrating to the south from a more westerly longitude. The ship was turned on to a westerly course, and kept on it until the beginning of February, but as no opening was to be seen through the ice to the south, her head was turned to the east once more, and she returned to the neighbourhood of Seymour Island. On the 10th of February the vessel was in Sidney Herbert Bay, which formed the hitherto unvisited part of Erebus and Terror Gulf. As it was obviously impossible to get further to the south, Nordenskjöld decided to establish the winter station on one of the islands in this vicinity. A brief visit to Seymour Island did not reveal the wealth of fossil-bearing strata that was expected. Paulet Island was visited, and an interesting circular lake was discovered, lying in a circular range of hills. The banks of the lake bore ample evidences that at one time there had been great volcanic activity at that place, and the lake was evidently formed in the hollow of the extinct crater. The place did not appeal to them as a site for the winter station, and as further journeys revealed another island on the other side of Seymour Island, where there was a beach which appeared to be sheltered from the southward, the point whence the most violent winds blew, it was decided to build the hut there. The Antarctica anchored in the bay opposite the beach, and rapidly unloaded the camp equipment. When everything was almost landed, a movement in the ice at the mouth of the bay compelled the ship to stand out into open water, so the party of 6, who were to spend the winter on the island, hastened ashore, where they had their hut to build and all preparations to make without any help, which had been counted upon, of the crew of the vessel. But this did not weigh heavily upon them, and they set to work with a will. In the course of a week the Antarctica was able to get into the bay again, and to land the remaining stores. But by that time the hut was up, and the adventurous 6 were almost settled down to their routine work. A day or so after landing, Nordenskjöld discovered that the island they were on, namely Snow Hill Island, was peculiarly interesting from a geological point of view, for he found fossils of ammonites, a token of ancient life of the region which alone would have made the expedition memorable. During the first month of their sojourn, the party were fully occupied in organizing their scientific work and in taking the preliminary trips to the island. At an early date they satisfied themselves that Admiralty Bay is sound, and that the portion of the continent extending to the vicinity was more in the nature of a group of scattered islands, with deep sounds passing between them, than a continuous stretch of mainland. The microscopical examination of the soil revealed the presence of numerous bacteria, while the examination of the waters showed that the lower forms of life were well represented. On the land there were abundance of penguins, seals, and migratory birds, but otherwise there was an absence of the animals found throughout the Arctic regions. On one point they had reason to be dissatisfied with the position selected for the station. At the time the site was chosen, it was believed that they would be well sheltered from the force of the gales. The reverse was found to be the case. Gales came from the southwest for days together, and blew with a velocity that was astounding. On one occasion a large bag of fossils left on the steps of the hut was blown yards away, while on another a barrel of bread was carried off, and a whaleboat was lifted over a second boat and flung against a mass of ice, a distance of 21 yards. When the boat was found, after the storm had abated, it was lying keel upwards, with the greater part of one side smashed in. The oars, thwarts, and inside planks were scattered and broken, even the zinc plating being stripped off and blown away. A curious phenomenon was observed during the progress of these gales. The air became saturated with electricity to such an extent that the metal parts of the instruments gave shocks to the fingers when touched, while the tips of men's fingers glowed with luminosity when outside the hut in the dark. As a similar thing occurs in the Sahara during the progress of a simoon or sandstorm, it was considered that the amount of electricity was caused by the friction set up by the particles of snow carried along in a never-ending cloud by the gale. The rate at which the dry particles of snow moved was tremendous. An extra severe gale carrying away the wind gauge, it was not possible to keep a complete record of the velocity of the gales, but from the records secured it was demonstrated that, during the first half of June, if the hut had travelled with the same velocity as the wind rushed past it, a distance of 14,900 miles would have been covered, or as far as from the hut to Sweden and halfway back. As winter approached, the storms obscured the sky and the sun was not often seen. They were not far enough south to lose it altogether, and all through the winter they had the benefit of its presence, though not for many hours at a time. When it did come, however, it came with great magnificence. After a series of storms they saw it rise one morning, and the spectacle is described as gorgeous and beautiful. The morning was so clear and bright that I absolutely do not know with what to compare it, Nordenskjöld wrote. A faint violet light lay along the horizon and over Cockburn Island, which forms the central point of view from the station. The sky gleams with a darker blue, and across it float long streamers of ribbon-like clouds, which shine and flame in red. but ever in the colours there is something pale, a paleness which predominates with indescribable delicateness of tone in the tints of the horizon, and in the blue and white shades of the stretches of land which contrast so strongly with the dull brown of our immediate neighbourhood, and even with the sharply defined ice wall of Snow Hill. At about 10 o'clock a glowing spot begins to be visible on the horizon, and, presaged by a perpendicular pillar of fire, there rises what would be the orb of the sun, but which, in consequence of refraction, appears to us to be a broad, flaming, moving belt of fire. On each side of the sun there are two shining, intensely rainbow-coloured belts, forming parts of a ring, which, however, can be seen but imperfectly. The sun rises higher in the heavens and assumes by degrees his ordinary appearance, whereupon these accessory phenomena disappear, together with the moon, whose crescent has been visible in the sky until the last possible moment. The winter passed without misfortune, and with the approach of spring preparations were made for the first long sledge journey. On this and other journeys they succeeded in travelling long distances over what was often heavy ice, on 2 meals a day. The first, which was the more substantial of the two, consisted of pemmican made into a thick porridge-like soup, the nutritious qualities of which were felt even as it was being eaten. This was followed by coffee, meat, biscuits, butter, and sugar. On such a meal the men existed and travelled all day, making no stop until the evening, when they had their dinner, consisting merely of peas or lentil soup, meat, chocolate, bread, butter, and sometimes bacon. Immediately they had eaten this frugal repast, they were in their sleeping bags and asleep. After climbing the ice ridges which rose along the shores of the mainland, they succeeded in reaching the land itself on the 18th of October, though as only evidence of it was the appearance of some dark-coloured rocks which showed above the ice. They were then in 56° 48' south and 62° 11' west. This was as far as they penetrated, and the rapidity of their movements is shown by the record they set of 38½ miles in one day. Other shorter trips taken over the islands in the vicinity of Snow Hill Island resulted in the discovery of important fossils, including the bones of an unknown vertebrate animal, some mammoth penguins, as well as the leaves of different kinds of pine trees and several ferns. These were all regarded as belonging to the Tertiary period. With the new year of 1903 they indulged in festivities, not only on account of the season, but also in anticipation of the early arrival of the Antarctica. As they had no idea of spending 2 winters in succession in the station, they had not been rigidly economical with their stores. There was no shortage in anything, but there was not enough to last them during the second winter on the same scale that they had lived during the first. When the days went by and grew into weeks, and no ship appeared, they began to take note of these things. For a time they kept on the lookout, and at night would conjecture at what hour on the following day the Antarctica would appear, and by whom she would first be seen; but as the months slipped by and no ship appeared, they dropped the subject with one accord, and, instead of discussing when the vessel would arrive, they talked about the best way of spending their second winter at the station. The penguin roosts were visited, and large numbers of the birds were killed and stored away for winter food, while seals were slaughtered to provide food for the dogs and clothing for the men. Although they never discussed it, the idea each man had about the non-arrival of the Antarctica was that she had become caught in the ice, and so prevented from reaching them until it was too late in the season. What had actually occurred never suggested itself. After passing the winter as was arranged, the Antarctica had proceeded to Tierra del Fuego and South Georgia, had picked up all the members of the expedition, and had steamed away to the south, so as to reach the winter station early in January. As she advanced, however, she found the sea so blocked with ice that she could not follow the course she had sailed the previous year. When she arrived at Hope Bay, some miles to the north of the station, Professor Anderson and 2 companions landed with sledges and sufficient provisions to last 9 men for 2 months. It was their intention to proceed over the ice to the station, while the Antarctica steamed away to the west, in the hopes of finding an opening through the ice which would enable her to reach the station. If, on the arrival of the relief party at the station, the Antarctica had not appeared, they were to return, with the other 6, and wait for the ship at Hope Bay. Before proceeding over the ice to the station, the 3 built a small stone hut, where they stored the greater portion of the stores, and with the remainder on their sledges they started on their march. But the ice, which had been too compact for the ship to penetrate, was not compact enough for them to traverse. Delay after delay was caused by leads and channels, until it was forced upon them that they would not be able to reach the station until the summer was over and the ice formed solid over the sea. As by that time the Antarctica ought to have arrived at the station, they decided their best course was to return to the depot at Home Bay and await her advent. They did so, but no ship appeared, and with the end of summer it was clear to them that something had happened either to the ship or at the station, and that the only thing left for them to do was to make themselves as comfortable as they could. With the limited store of provisions they had with them, it was necessary for them to go on short rations at once, though the capture of some penguins, the shooting of seals, and the catching of fish by means of a hook made from a strap buckle and a line of sealskin torn into strips, augmented their stock of food and gave them also, in the blubber of the seals, fuel and light. Cooped up in their little stone hut, which was only built large enough, in the first instance, as the place to hold their stores, they went through the dreary months of winter with a contentment which was the very acme of heroism. Meanwhile the Antarctica had steamed away to the west, and then, a chance offering itself, had stood to the south until she was in the latitude of Paulet Island. She turned to the east, heading in the direction of the station on Snow Hill Island, when the ice caught her. For days she remained in the pack, those on board chafing at the delay and trying every device to get her free. But the ice was too strong, and at last they were forced to admit that they were caught for the winter. This was bad enough, but there was worse to follow. A movement began in the pack, and a pressure ridge started directly for the ship. It was upon them almost before they realized it, and the crash with which she heeled over told its own tale. The ice had torn a length of her keel away, and had made a hole in her which it was impossible to repair. Everything that could be got out was thrown on to the ice, and the ship's company formed themselves into sledge parties, to convey as much as they could to the nearest land. This was Paulet Island, where they arrived after an arduous march, and at once set to work to construct a shelter for the winter which was now upon them. There they stayed, within a few miles of the station and of the other party at Hope Bay, but all in ignorance of the proximity of one another, and quite unable to communicate. With the first sign of approaching spring, the men at the station made arrangements to resume their expeditions and complete the survey of the island in their immediate vicinity. The first trip was in the direction of Hope Bay, and the party had been out some days, when, in the dim light, one thought he saw an unusual dark patch on the ice in the distance. He drew his companions' attention to it, but neither cared to trust their eyes. As they approached nearer, the dark patch resolved itself into the figures of men, and a still nearer view revealed 2 such extraordinary creatures that one of the men from the station thought it would be as well to have a revolver ready in case of emergencies. The 2 figures were in black garments, with black caps on their heads, and their hands and faces were as black as their clothes, while the upper parts of their faces were hidden by curious-looking masks. Besides them was a sledge. With considerable uncertainty the men from the station approached, and were not reassured when they were asked in English how they were. "Thanks, how are you?" they replied. "Don't you know us?" one of the strange-looking creatures asked. "We're the relief party. Have you seen the ship?" Then a third figure appeared from behind an ice hammock, where he had been preparing a meal. They were Professor Anderson and his companions, who were on their way, for a second time, to the station. Without loss of time the reunited comrades made their way to the station, where soap and water and a fresh supply of clothes soon transformed the appearance of the 3 who had had so trying a time in the little stone hut at Hope Bay. But the situation was still fraught with anxiety, now that both parties realized something very serious had happened to the Antarctica. It was impossible for them to determine whether she had gone to the bottom or had been beset in the ice. Only one thing was clear, and that was that they would all have to stay where they were until some help came to them. While they were still debating what chances there were of any coming before another winter went by, they were startled, one day, by the arrival of visitors. These proved to be a search party from the Argentine cruiser Uruguay, which the Argentine government had dispatched, as the Antarctica had not returned at her appointed time. Help had come at a time, and from a quarter least expected. But the news that the cruiser brought added very much to the fears the explorers entertained as to the safety of the Antarctica and her crew. If she had been beset, some of her company could have reached the station over the ice while it was still compact, and if she was still afloat, she ought herself to have been able to reach them. The absence of all news made the members of the expedition gathered at the station more than uneasy as to the fate of their comrades. The morning after the Argentine officers arrived, one of the men, looking out of the hut, exclaimed that 8 men were coming over the ice. Under the impression that they were some of the cruiser's crew, sent to assist in removing the baggage from the station to the ship, he went out to meet them, walking slowly as he tried to decide what was to be done, if they could not speak any language he knew. The others in the hut, watching him, saw him suddenly leap forward, and then turn to them and wave his arms. "Larsen! Larsen is here!" they heard him shout. With one accord they rushed out after him, and in a few moments were eagerly shaking hands with the 8 men, who were a detachment sent out from the camp on Paulet Island to ascertain whether the party at the station was still intact or whether it had been rescued. The news was sent to the cruiser, and soon all the members of the expedition and their baggage were on board and the ship was steaming for Paulet Island. On arrival off the coast, no signs of the remainder of the crew of the Antarctica were to be seen, so the whistle was blown. The men at the time were all in the shelter, sleeping, and the sudden sound of the whistle roused them. For the moment they could not believe their ears. Then one of them looked out and saw the ship, and the shout with which he and his companions greeted the sight rang far out over the water. Professor Anderson and his 2 comrades had left the Antarctica on the 29th of December 1902, the ship was nipped on the 10th of January 1903, and the castaways arrived at Paulet Island at the end of February. They had lived in the shelter they constructed, subsisting mostly on penguin, until November, when the Argentine cruiser arrived. Only 1 man had died. The expedition reached Buenos Aires on the 30th of November 1903, having, during the time they had been in the Antarctic, collected a mass of interesting and valuable scientific information. End of section 20. Section 21 of The Romance of Polar Exploration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr. The Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott. Chapter 18. Britain Holds Her Own. The British expedition, dispatched under the international agreement, was destined not only to surpass the achievements of the other 2, but also to establish a series of records superior to anything that has yet been accomplished in polar exploration, either in the northern or southern hemispheres. The members of the expedition, consisting of naval officers and men, officers of the Mercantile Marine, Royal Naval Reserve, and civilian scientists, sailed from Cowes on the 6th of August 1908, on board the Discovery, a vessel specifically built for the purpose. The ship proceeded to New Zealand, and left there on the 28th of November 1901 for Victoria Land. They arrived there on the 24th of December. In selecting the members of the expedition, great care had been exercised, and the excellent results of the voyage may in a great measure be attributed to this. No other qualification than fitness was allowed to rank with the selecting committee, so that everyone on board the Discovery knew what he had to do and was capable of doing it. This is particularly true in regard to the commander, Captain Robert F. Scott from the Royal Navy, of whom the President of the Royal Geographical Society justly said, "The skilful and bold navigator, the ideal director of a scientific staff, the organizer of measures securing the health and good spirits of his people, and the beloved commander of the chosen band of explorers who are ready to face hardships and dangers to secure his approval. Throughout the entire period the expedition was away, the attitude of the commander was entirely in keeping with the grandest traditions of the service to which he belonged, and would serve to place his name in the brilliant list of polar heroes, quite apart from the splendid feats he personally performed while in the Atlantic. Prominent amongst these stands the record of farthest south, achieved by Scott and two comrades in September 1902, when the flag was carried to 82° 17' south, or some 250 miles nearer the pole than it had yet been. The first point touched by the Discovery on her voyage along the coast of Victoria Land was Cape Adare, when the Nunes expedition, under Borchgrevink, passed the winter of 1899. Here a brief landing was effected, a collection made of rocks in the neighbourhood, and a cairn built to hold a record for the information of the relief ship which was to be sent out in the following year. Continuing the voyage to the south, the explorers visited Wood Bay, and subsequently discovered an excellent harbour as far south as 76° 31' south. Landing at Cape Crozier on the 22nd of January, and leaving another record there for the information of the relief ship, the Discovery went east along the ice barrier until the 165th meridian of longitude was passed, when the barrier was found to trend to the north, the sea becoming rapidly more shoal. The coastline was followed to 76° south, or 150 miles further than the expeditions before had gone. The ship then turned, and in 174° eastern longitude a place was seen where an inlet ran into the barrier. A sledge party went on the ice and penetrated as far as 78° 50' south, the point reached by Borchgrevink in his sledge trip. By this time it was realized that winter quarters must be selected, and the Discovery sailed to that point of the sea where Mount Erebus and Mount Terror reared their lofty heads on the land. Examining the land for a suitable site for the camp, it was learned that both Erebus and Terror are situated on an island, and not, as was formerly believed, on the mainland. At the opposite end of the island another smaller volcanic mount was seen, with a still smaller one between it and the two giants. The larger of these was named Mount Discovery, and near its base the site of the camp was chosen. The ship was worked in as close to the shore as was possible before the heavy frost set in, and as she was well constructed to withstand the pressure of ice, she remained in this position until, after the second winter had been passed, the relief ship arrived with sufficient explosives to blast a way out of the ice. As soon as the members of the expedition had settled down and all was made snug, trips were taken in all directions along the coast and over the ice. The longest trip taken in the following September was arranged for, food depots being established as far to the south as the stores could be conveyed. On this trip, the historic one of the expedition, only 3 went. These were Captain Scott, Lieutenant Shackleton, and Dr. Wilson. They had dogs with them at the start, but the animals grew sick and weak, and were at last quite useless in dragging the sledges. The 3 harnessed themselves to the sledges in place of the dogs, and handicapped with this weight of 240 pounds each, they pushed on until they reached 82° 17' south. From the position they then occupied, they were able to see as far as 83° 20' south, and would have gone as far, if not further, but for an insuperable obstacle that confronted them. The route they followed was over rough ice, often yawning with deep crevasses, down which the sledges had to be lowered and then hauled up on the other side. Some of them were veritable chasms, but they faded into insignificance when compared with the one which opened before the explorers at the end of the march. For a time they examined this mighty ice ravine to see if it were not possible, one way or another, to get across. The descent might have been possible, and there was no great difficulty in crossing the floor of it, but the far side rose in an unbroken precipice, and they recognized it as insurmountable, even to such daring and intrepid climbers as themselves. From the latitude they had attained, they were able to learn that Victoria Land is traversed by a range of high mountains, which, in 82° south, were from 10,000 to 14,000 feet high. A line of foothills, closely resembling Admiralty Mountains in appearance, rose in longitude 160° east. The route gradually ascended, as the party progressed, until a level, unbroken plain was reached, the altitude of which was 9,000 feet. The coastline could be seen stretching away due south to the 83rd parallel. On the way back, Lieutenant Shackleton unfortunately ruptured a blood vessel during an unusually heavy strain at the sledges. The strength of all the party was severely taxed by the hardships of the journey, and the sudden incapacitating of one of the three was a matter of grave anxiety. He was relieved of the weight of his sledge, but they all realized that if they were to get back alive to the ship, Lieutenant Shackleton would have to walk, as the other two were utterly unable to drag the sledges, with the food and supplies, and his weight as well. With heroic determination he followed them on foot, only complaining that his injury effectively prevented him from doing his share in the hard work. So they journeyed, arriving at the ship after an absence of 94 days, during which they must have covered quite 1,000 miles. The speed at which they travelled, when the ice conditions would allow them to proceed, was as high as 32 miles a day, a speed far greater than had been attained by other explorers, with one exception, even when the sledges have been drawn by dog teams. The exception was the record set by another party of the Discovery explorers, who, without dogs, and with heavy sledge, 240 pounds a man, covered 33 miles a day over the inland ice. This party went out in a westerly direction, and passed over the interior of Victoria Land, which they found covered with an ice cap forming a great plain 9,000 feet above the sea level. They were 53 days absent, and at their farthest were 142 miles from the ship. When they turned back, the plain on the horizon seemed to be higher than where they stood, and rocks occasionally showed. Between this plain and the coast they had several magnificent views of glaciers. In following one down, they had an interesting evidence of the fact that the ice in these regions is receding, though at a rate that will require many centuries to pass before it is all melted and the land made available for human settlement. They had followed down the glacier for a day, and the ice became so very rough they were obliged to leave their sledges behind them and proceed with the greatest care. As they continued to descend, the glacier gradually dwindled, and then suddenly ended in a low wall of ice. In the valley beyond were some frozen lakes, beyond which the valley changed into a series of deep, narrow gorges, filled with long lines and confused heaps of stones and other debris, shed from the glacier as it melted. Perhaps in this valley, more than anywhere else, lay the evidence of what was happening and what had been. There lay the glacier, inert and dead, while the summer sun was gradually wasting its huge mass. On either side its shrinking tributaries had already severed their connection with it, and receded up the mountain sides. Everything pointed to receding glaciation. Not only were the gorges filled with the stones and debris of the moraines, but thousands of feet up the hillsides they lay in clear-cut lines, showing how vast the proportions of the glacier had once been. Other glaciers observed gave the same indications. One of these, named the Ferrar Glacier, after the discoverer, was described as containing probably as much ice as any hitherto known in the world. Two others, the Burns and the Shackleton glaciers, each contained a great deal more, but all were greatly shrunk from the tremendous proportions they must once have had, and which could be traced by the lines of moraines. It was from observing these glaciers, and speculating upon the immeasurable quantities of ice that once must have slowly flowed along them to the sea, that a theory was formed as to the real significance of the great ice barrier lying to the south of the Antarctic Circle. The opinion was generally entertained that the ice in this barrier is afloat. It had receded from the time when Ross first discovered it. Even while the expedition was in the neighbourhood it receded. In September 1902 a depot was established on the ice at a line drawn between a volcanic peak at the extreme end of Minna Bluff and the top of Mount Discovery. In November 1903 This spot was found to have moved 608 yards out of the alignment, moving east of north. On the sides of Mount Terror, 800 feet above the existing surface of the barrier, moraines marked its original height. From these facts it was reasoned that at one time the ice forming the cap over the Antarctic continent was enormously deeper than it is today, and that it had then extended out into the Antarctic Ocean for probably hundreds of miles than it now reaches. The slow but steady flow of the great ice stream had absolutely filled the sea off the coast of Victoria Land, and the barrier, now existing, was the remains of this once mighty mass. It was on one of these exploring journeys that a curious experience befell one party, a member of which unfortunately lost his life in consequence. The party were out with sledges and had halted for a midday meal when a violent gale sprang up. As usual, the wind set the snow in motion, and soon the men found themselves in a whirling cloud of finely powdered snow, which entirely shut out their view in all directions. Believing themselves to be in the vicinity of the ship, they left the sledges and set out to march to the vessel. Soon they found themselves on the slope, which they fancied they recognized as one that had led down to where the ship lay in the ice. As they cautiously advanced, one of the men missed his footing. What with the force of the wind, the insecure foothold on the moving snow, and the declivity of the slope, he was unable to stop himself, and slipped past his comrades and out of sight in the whirling snow with the speed of lightning. The officer in charge halted the other men, and all crouched down, expecting their comrade to rejoin them as soon as he secured his footing. After waiting some time, without his appearing, the officer advanced to find him. With the first step he also went out of sight, as though he had been shot from a gun. Then a third went forward, and was at once lost to the sight of the others in the same way. The remainder of the men, after waiting for some time, concluded the three had reached the ship, and determined to set out after them. One man, a young New Zealander named Hare, set off to reach the sledges and recover his mittens. In the confusion of the whirling snow, his absence was not noted, and the rest of the party set out for the ship, which they were satisfied was quite near. As a matter of fact, they were entirely out of their bearings. The man who took the lead walked very cautiously down the slope. He had heavy tacks in the boots he was wearing, and was thus enabled to get a firm hold of the snow. To this he owed his life, for through the drifting snow he suddenly saw an open chasm yawn at his feet. He threw himself back, and shouted to those behind to stop. All tried to do so, but the man next to the leader was unable to pull up. His feet shot from under him, and he was seen to dash past them like a flash. Out of the 9 who had originally formed the party, 4 now remained together. Warned by the sudden disappearance of the man Vince, who had shot past them over the precipice, the 4 moved with the greatest deliberation and caution. At length they were able to reach the shore and locate the ship, whither they hastened with the news. The alarm was at once given, steam was got up, the siren was set to work, and its shrill notes penetrated far and wide, while relief parties were organized and dispatched. Knowing the route the men were to have taken, no difficulty was experienced in tracking down the abandoned sledges. But on arrival there, the relief party was astounded to find the officer and the 2 men who had vanished from the others while descending the snow slope. The astonishment was increased when not one of the 3 could explain how they had succeeded in returning to the sledges. They remembered their experiences as they were hurled down the snow slope, and each one told the same tale. Immediately they had stood up against the gale. They felt their feet go from under them with incredible speed, so fast indeed as to have absolutely no control over themselves, and they plunged into a mass of soft snow. There they found themselves and one another. They were still dazed when found. Subsequent examination showed that the slope down which they had been hurled extended for a distance of 500 yards, and terminated with the bank of snow into which they had plunged. The bank was within 15 feet of a cliff, which had a clear drop of 200 feet to the shore ice below. It was over this cliff that Vince had gone, and no trace of the unfortunate fellow was ever found. Nor were the relief parties successful in discovering Hare, the New Zealander. When all had returned to the ship, he was also given up as lost. but to the amazement of everyone he was seen returning to the ship on the second day after the gale. He explained that on his way back to the sledges he had fallen in the snow, and had lost consciousness, returning to his senses some time after, to find himself completely buried in a snowdrift. He had struggled out and made his way to the ship. It was his turn to be amazed when he was told he had been searched for during the whole of the previous day. It was some time before he would believe that what he referred to as today was in reality yesterday. He had lain in the snow for a period of 36 hours. When he fell, the heavy snow had apparently covered him, and so kept the heat of his body from leaving him. He had thus sunk into a heavy snow sleep, and his physical stamina had done the rest in helping him towards recovery. His escape, without even a frostbite, is unique in the annals of polar experiences. During the second year of their stay, a discovery was made which, from a geological point of view, exceeded in value all the others put together. It was in October that a sledge party set out to penetrate into the interior of Victoria Land. They travelled over the ice plain at an average altitude of 9,000 feet until, in 78° south and 146° 30' east, they were at a distance of 270 miles from the ship. The interior of the land seemed to stretch in a vast continental plateau continuously at a height of 9,000 feet. In one of the many ravines examined, sandstone strata was discovered, in one of which there was a narrow seam of fossil plants. The coal measure was only 1/8 of an inch in thickness, but within it were found specimens of plants belonging to the Miocene period. In February 1904 the relief ship Morning arrived at the station, and with the explosives she brought with her, the Discovery was freed from the ice and commenced her homeward journey. She had completed a stay of 2 winters in a latitude 500 miles further south than any other ship had wintered, while the expedition had reaped a success such as no other expedition has ever achieved in either Arctic or Antarctic regions. End of section 21. End of the Romance of Polar Exploration by G. Firth Scott.